Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the Lego Movie 2, the second part. When the Lego Movie came out, it was a total unexpected kind of hit. It was subversive, it was weird, it had all these theories going on within it. It was a really solid, awesome motion picture. And then the Lego Movie 2 comes out after, two Lego movies between this Lego Batman and the Lego Ninjago movie, and now we have this one. Now maybe that's like unfair for this movie necessarily, because it is more of an exact follow-up rather than those other two movies sort of actually doing that. But I think the Lego Movie 2 is still a fun movie if you're just here to see a bunch of jokes and have a good time with your kid. The Lego Movie 2 is fine. In terms of what the Lego Movie did and how it was able to do so much more with a film that was basically just a toy tie-in than you ever thought was possible, the second one just sort of never really does that cohesively as the first one really did. And that's really ultimately the biggest disappointment for me, because I still had fun with it. I liked all the beautiful colors and how much more of a musical this one was than the previous one. I actually kind of like that, but I think in some ways this film tried to be a different movie, and I think the plot was, if I described it, a different film, but the structure of it tried to be the same film, and that really did not work at all. And some of that is maybe because they liked the success of the first one and sort of wanted to repeat it. I know they had all sorts of director changes, one of which being Rob Schrab, who I was excited for, but then they fired, and then he ended up directing the last season of Mystery Science Theater. Instead, they chose Mike Mitchell, who previously directed Trolls, which I totally hated. I don't hate this as much as Trolls. This is a much better directed film than Trolls, maybe because it was written by Phil Lord and Chris Miller, and Trolls was written by awfulness and morally had all sorts of issues. And maybe that's why morally this film can't manage to really say what it wants to say while hinting at a bunch of other things. It kind of hints at a much more interesting narrative going on within it that it never really achieves. Theory-wise, the original Lego Movie did all these things like about creativity and a father-son relationship and the idea of a collector versus someone who just wants to play, and there was a lot to go into with that, especially with a toy like Legos. And this one is supposed to be about a boy and his sister, the sister actually being played by Brooklyn Prince from the Florida Project, who, it was cool that she gets to do something big like this. And I kind of didn't feel like a lot of that was fleshed out enough to really work, because it's kind of playing this thing in the movie with all the Lego people and stuff of having like, the dark and brooding kind of teenage boy side versus kind of the brightly colored pink girl side, but it's not playing with like, well, he's going through that brooding dark thing because he's a teenager and he thinks everything that's quote unquote dark is cool and interesting. They don't really play with like having anything to do with that theory of like why teenage boys like that. They mention it. Chris Pratt, when he's playing the two different characters, he brings that up, but they don't really do anything with that. It's more about like that they won't play together, and it feels like the narrative is actually trying to say more than that, but then doesn't actually achieve it when they get to like some sort of a conclusion, which is just like, hey, they should play together. Duh. The spoilers, I guess, sort of not really. There's so much more like that. The relationship, like maybe they did start playing together, but their interests kind of shifted in such a way. And I also think the narrative doesn't really work into the brother-sister relationship or a sibling relationship, in which like, although it is not cool that he like hit her stuff and broke it, it is also not cool to antagonize someone to the point, or stealing their toys and so forth, that they are actually going to do something like that is not a positive trait either. Now, Maya Rudolph's mother character actually does get mad at both of them, which is something I actually, as a parent and stuff, agree with, is that if you have two kids, obviously hitting is bad, I'm not saying it isn't, but if you have someone who drives someone and antagonizes someone to the point where they get frustrated and do something bad, clearly the person who did something bad is wrong, but the person who antagonized them is also wrong. It's just a not good situation, and she handled that obviously very well. But the narrative of the film acts like more like, oh no, we're an innocent, good, wonderful side, and you should come over to us, which is honestly exactly like what Mike Mitchell did with Trolls, which I fucking hated, and I just realized while I was talking this out right now. And I don't like that kind of one-sidedness, because I think in the Lego Movie it got into the whole idea of the special kind of making a critique on the idea of having the one and things like that. It had a critique on kind of commercialism while still being like the most commercial thing for a major blockbuster to be, which is a Lego movie, and then be subversive and about creativity and the power of creativity and all that. And this just isn't like, I would have liked for them to get into the fact that he's getting away from Legos, he's trying to be this dark, brooding kid. You could have had the brother and sister relationship kind of fleshed out a lot more, but they don't do that, which kind of doesn't really work because that's the whole point of the whole narrative there. And I think this film honestly was much more concerned with being another installment than really saying anything with the narrative, which is a real shame because Phil Lord and Chris Miller, their last movie that they wrote and produced was Into the Spider-Verse. Now I understand they didn't direct either of those, and there's, you know, whole articles about are they like producer auteurs and stuff, and I would say they actually are, but the directors is what makes these movies. There's a big difference from the directorial team that made Into the Spider-Verse and the Lego Movie 2, and why we're celebrating one and the other is kind of like, oh, that came out this weekend, cool. I think Into the Spider-Verse does well with all those complex, interesting ideas and saying something with it. Lego Movie 2 doesn't, because it's more interested in being kind of a regular kind of poppy blockbuster thing, and it halts at being kind of the much more interesting one that is saying more while also making a fun movie. This is just a fun movie, and I guess that's fine. If I were going to rank the Lego movies probably obviously number 1, and then 2 would be Lego Batman, and then I put this at 3rd, frankly, because Lego Batman's saying something about Batman. It's doing interesting things with the iconography. I don't think they're doing much that's really that interesting with this. They're just kind of like having some jokes and having some fun with the Lego thing, and that's kind of like boring at this point, you know. And I think the randomness of the Lego stuff, I mean, certainly I think they do a much better job of that in the actual Lego movies, I guess, than in Lego Batman's obviously more in just a Batman world, just as with like Lego people, and Ninjago, I guess, same thing. And this is like they are able to be more free-willing and free-spirited, and like what they did to Unikitty and like all those things. I really like that. I also like Chris Pratt did a great job doing 2 kind of performances as he plays this like other guy who clearly is doing a Kurt Russell impression. I thought that was actually really funny since he was in Guardians of the Galaxy 2 with Kurt Russell. I mean, I liked all the voice talent. I like Maya Rudolph. Tiffany Haddish was particularly great. They still do a well cast, and they still try quite a bit, but this is similar to what happened to me with Incredibles 2, where The Incredibles is a film that meant a lot to me. It said a lot about superheroism and the idea of superheroes, and made probably a better Watchmen movie than like the Watchmen movie. And then you see the sequel and you're like, oh cool, another installment, and you kind of think you'd be cool with that, but at this point it's like, I don't know if I really need that anymore. I can have fun with a lot of different blockbusters, and sure, maybe it's because I've been kind of overexposed to this Lego thing, or also because I was kind of spoiled on an original film, and if this was like unconnected or whatever, if you remove it from its context, which is kind of missing the entire point, then sure, maybe it's really good. But I think like it is a fun time to have with kids. I also don't think like this whole idea that it's a comment on toxic masculinity or it's a feminist narrative, I don't necessarily believe in that. I think semi it is, but it doesn't really work the same way Wreck-It Ralph does, because Emmett's character is asked to change by his girlfriend, not by his own like insecurities as a man. Certainly it plays on to that, but it's a little different when like everybody in your society is like, hey, could you change? And then he changes into the thing you ask him to. Toxic masculinity by definition actually doesn't do that. It's like if you're a jerk and you're just like constantly putting particularly women down or anyone down and making yourself this big macho person, and Emmett was very much not trying to do that, and they kind of pushed him into that. So I sort of see where people are going with that, but I think people are making a little too much of a big deal out of that. It's probably more of Wreck-It Ralph 2, but also all these things, it's like you can't like make these characters into those things to make a comment on the toxic masculinity thing. You need a character who's actually toxic masculinity. So I get that what people are trying to do, but they ended up not really fully saying anything with it. I don't know. In this case, I just feel like certainly, I guess the other character Chris Pratt's playing, Rex Danger Vest, I guess is. I guess maybe he is. Sure, fine. I still had a good time, but it felt like very forgettable. I saw it last night, I often am like sort of remembering things. Some of the songs were cool. I like the credit song that Lonely Island, who I don't think I've heard them do anything really, unless someone in the comments is going to tell me I'm totally wrong, since Popstar, which I really appreciate that hey, they're back. It was cool hearing everyone from Noel Fielding to Richard Ayoade, Alison Brie. I liked a lot of the jokes from, Abraham Lincoln said I had theater tickets, to the Gandalf reference to them saying Marvel wouldn't call us back, to having Jason Momoa go, yeah, it was cool. It is a little weird, though, I will say, to have him say, yeah, and then, like, have Channing Tatum still be Superman, or, like, Gal Gadot isn't Wonder Woman or anything like that. Like, they're like, well, we already did that, so they're still the things, but, like, Aquaman's Jason Momoa is, like, something I guess we're just not going to address. I think if you're going to see this and have a good time, you will have one. But in terms of anything theoretical or kind of being like, hey, the first Lego movie is actually really good and interesting, and I even thought, like, it did similar things to what They Live did in some cases, and this is, like, not that, it's just like a fun movie with Legos, and I guess, for most people that's fine. For me, I found it a bit of a disappointment. I think it just didn't piece together. It could have maybe been something a little better if they had fleshed out those relationships more, and I think there actually is a good movie in this narrative and in this story. It just, this movie isn't that movie. You could say something about how, like, teenage boys go into this darker phase and kind of analyze that. You could have analyzed him and his sister having these arguments. You could have said something more about conflict, but I don't think you're saying anything really about conflict if you're like, hey, this one side is, like, totally good, but this other side is, like, evil. And it's kind of the problem I had with the fascistic nature of the Trolls movie, and I'm not joking about that, is that I don't like presenting these arguments that are completely one-sided to children who are understanding what conflict is. Why don't we give them a much more nuanced understanding of conflict, which would help them make better decisions in our future, which would probably be better for the world overall if that's how we're going to teach them. Just saying, not that the Lego Movie 2 is as bad as the Trolls movie, and not that all our kids who see the Trolls movies will be mini Hitlers. I'm just saying it's like a good 60-40 chance. Anyway, point being is the Lego Movie 2, I don't think it lives up to the Lego Movie and the impressiveness that the Lego Movie really did. It made everybody, it was a very beloved film by both critics and audiences. And this film, when it was coming out, the anticipation really wasn't there. And I thought, well, maybe this movie has everything going against it, like the first one. Maybe this will be good for it. And it ended up like everyone could kind of smell that this wasn't going to be anything all that different or that interesting. At some points maybe the brand was a little diluted, but I think that doesn't matter because they could not have had two movies between this, and I still really wouldn't, I would still probably feel the same way. It just doesn't feel as opened up and weird and crazy, and they're not, I can't believe they did all this and said all these things and said all these theories and were able to say these things about commercialism and be subversive and political and things like that in a movie about Legos. And Lego Movie 2, I'm like, oh cool, they had enjoyable songs and it's colorful, and I think that's kind of ultimately very disappointing. But if you look at it under the guise of what it is, I guess it's a fun movie. If you look at it behind any of the theories or trying to do the amazingness that the first one did, and really you could say with that movie everything is awesome. Everything in this movie is just sort of subpar, and I guess you sort of have to just sing a bunch of songs and be cool with that and enjoy the performances and colors. And if you're cool with that, I guess you'll be cool with the Lego Movie 2, the second part. So if you have seen the Lego Movie 2, the second part, and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.